All right, I think we can get started. Welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. This is the fifth session of the High Steps seminar series. Today we are very happy to welcome Matteo Collodel. Matteo has received his PhD in philosophy from Foscari University of Venice, where he remains affiliated. He has held research positions at various places, including Humboldt University in Berlin and at the Institute Vienna Circle, the University of Vienna, where he is currently a research fellow. His recent work includes the chapter Critical Rationalism and the Debate over the Rationality of Science, which has appeared in the Routledge Handbook of the History of Philosophy of Science after Kant, edited by Flavia Padovani and Adam Tuboli, which I'm very, very happy to be able to show the hard copy of which, very thick book, whose existence we owe to the incredible effort by Adam and Flavia, above all. And Matteo has also a lot of amazing publications. He also has in the cards a co-edited volume on Feyerabend and Austrian philosophy, which is going to appear soon in the summer or later this year. Which will appear as part of the Vienna Circle Institute yearbook, published by Springer. Please, Matteo, correct me if I say anything wrong. In 2026, so just now, he started work on the project Against Authority, both Feyerabend's Life and Thought at the Institute Vienna Circle at the University of Vienna, a 4-year project, which is funded by the Austrian Science Fund. So we want to thank and to welcome warmly Matteo for having accepted our invitation. We look very much forward to his talk. And let me just remind you that the talk will be about 45 minutes. But just to say that we will have time, plenty of time for discussion. So remain with us. There will be time to discuss and to ask questions. I'm now leaving the floor to Matteo and to his talk, which is titled Against Authority, Political Roots of Feyerabend's Epistemology.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks to Matteo for having and Roberto for having me in this series. Today, I will give an overview of the basically what's the idea underlying my project of an intellectual biography of Feyerabend, emphasizing its political aspect rather than the epistemological one, or at least trying to look at Feyerabend's intellectual trajectory also from this ethical and political point of view. So this is let me just see, an overview of my talk. An outline of my talk. I would give a little overview of Feyerabend's intellectual trajectory, and then I will linger on 3 different stages in this trajectory in order to show the political, what I consider to be some interesting political aspects of his thought. So the theoretical pluralist phase, what Feyerabend called the skeptical phase, and then the most famous epistemological anarchism against method of the 70s and 80s. And then I will try to trace back this political anti-authoritarian stance to some aspect of Feyerabend's life and both intellectual life and intellectual legacy from the Vienna tradition. So let me start with the little overview of Feyerabend's intellectual trajectory that spreads out the second half of the 20th century. It's now customary to distinguish different stages in this trajectory. An initial phase of formative years that can be considered more in a larger or in a more or in a stricter sense. It's develops throughout the second half of the 40s, so after the Second World War, during his university studies in Vienna, and up to, for some, for others, could be even shorter, but his first academic position at the University of Bristol until 1958. And then we have what I consider to be Feyerabend's philosophical breakthrough, with his proposal of a theoretical, specific kind of theoretical pluralism in the first half of the 60s. Second half of the 60s starts this skeptical phase that spreads throughout the early 70s, when the more famous epistemological anarchism of against method is developed, and that's the stage in Feyerabend's career for which he is more famous. Then we have a final metaphysical phase in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, what's the received view about Feyerabend's position? It's not easy to pin it down, but if we consider his most famous work, Against Method and Science in a Free Society, these two books, we can see how this came to be perceived. This is now given a pretty famous quote from this Nature article from the late 80s, so at the very end of what is considered to be Feyerabend's anarchistic stage, where science has gone wrong. And here, famously, we have this quotation that was used also as a title of a collection of essays, in which we see as Feyerabend was considered the Salvador Dali of academic philosophy and currently the worst enemy of science. So this was the Feyerabend, the jester, kind of, some anarchic and also heretic and also maybe eccentric individual in academic philosophy, and someone who was associated with a critical stance towards science. Now, in order to have this overview, I would also, it's also interesting to look at reviews of Feyerabend's autobiography that was published shortly after he passed away in the mid-90s. And this review from the New York Times book review, Feyerabend found anarchy was more fun than science. And this is also a nice quotation to see how Feyerabend came to be perceived. And the author writes, Against Method is never much more than an invitation to safe sex. And its advocacy of prudent fun also explains much of its appeal. So it's again this idea that Feyerabend is a thought-provoking thinker, an eccentric perhaps, but someone who is fun to read, but perhaps not to be taken too seriously, or at least only from this point of view of having again the jester, an academic jester. A more considered evaluation was given by Richard Rorty in the review of Killing Time. Rorty writes something interesting. Just as James learned a lot from Peirce, while sensibly refraining from glossing him in any detail, so leading contemporary philosophers of science learned a lot from Feyerabend, but would not wish to try to reconstruct his arguments. For neither Peirce nor Feyerabend ever really got his act together. The writings of both are full of good ideas and will probably continue to be mined. But most of us will continue to assign James and Dewey rather than Peirce when inculcating pragmatism, and Kuhn and Wittgenstein rather than Feyerabend when explaining what was wrong with logical empiricism. So here again, this idea of a thought provoker, but someone whose arguments were not tide-proof, I would say. Probably an experience that everybody who has tried to read Feyerabend's papers is that it's not so easy to pin his arguments down. Sometimes they seem too radical. The conclusions to which he wants to arrive at are to be supported by the arguments that he proposes. So, and this is Roth's take. Feyerabend is interesting, lots of good ideas, but not someone that can be taken seriously, not only because he is fun and he is provoking somehow, but also because his arguments are not so good. Now, what's the point here? I think this is a fair way to look at Feyerabend's intellectual trajectory. Feyerabend's output has all sorts of problems, but I guess, and this is my bet, that Feyerabend's intellectual trajectory can also be viewed from the point of view not just of epistemology or philosophy, but from a point of view of anti-authoritarianism, this underlying theme throughout his own intellectual trajectory that keeps together the different stages in which he developed his own ideas. And I think that only if we look at his arguments, epistemological and in epistemology and philosophy of science, from the point of view of his anti-authoritarian stance, we can evaluate and appreciate them better than we do if we look them, strictly speaking, from a theoretical or philosophical point of view, where they have some problems. So let me show you, what I will try to show now is that in every stage of his intellectual development, we can find these political underlying themes. So I will start with theoretical pluralism. So Feyerabend's philosophical breakthrough. And it's interesting here to look at this note that we can find in his literary estate from the 7th of August, 1963, in which he gives an overview of his own output since so far, that far. He describes the main topic of his research during the last 10 years, which means 53, 63, more or less. So the first part of his own intellectual trajectory, basically. So covering both his formative years and the first part of his theoretical pluralism. I have obtained certain tentative results, and this is the first results that he lists. Empiricism has a good deal in common with authoritarian forms of knowledge, which are based either upon some basic text or upon the dictum of a personal authority. So this is the first point that he makes. His criticism of empiricism is a kind of criticism of an authoritarian form of knowledge. Research which emphasizes the need of an empirical foundation of knowledge is liable to lend to the establishment of a dogmatic system of thought. And he also makes a parallel between epistemology or philosophy of science and politics. It needs little persuasion and argument to show that the authoritarian way of life is undesirable. Within politics, the new principles we need will, of course, be the principle of democracy. It is only within science, and here it's not, as we can see, the worst enemy of science. It is only within science that we find a group of people who, in deeds, if not in words, are trying to make actual the idea of a knowledge that is completely non-authoritarian and that cannot therefore be said to rest upon foundations. It's an anti-foundationalist understanding of science and knowledge. To support these people, to defend them against the attacks of their sophisticated opponents is a prime task of a non-authoritarian and foundationless epistemology. And this is what he was trying to do, establish a non-authoritarian and foundationless epistemology. So, for example, in his famous or at least well-known essays, problems, he emphasizes, he highlights the problems of empiricism. He tried to show how one can be a good empiricist. And being a good empiricist means being tolerant in matters epistemological. And it also gives an outline of a pluralistic theory of knowledge and action. So this was his idea, his project, his research project during this stage. But as I tried to show, this project is not only in epistemology, but there's this kind of political understanding or ethical or political understanding of it. What's the idea? The distinction that it traces is that between a theoretical monism, in which you have empirical facts, and a scientific theory that is confronted by some empirical facts and that can be verified or falsified, or at least confirmed or falsified. But this is criticized because it is based on the idea of the autonomy of facts. Facts are autonomous and represent an authority, a kind of last authority. And what he wants, but what he wants to emphasize is that facts and theories are much more intimately connected than is admitted by the autonomy principle. Well, this is the critical target of his theoretical pluralism, the autonomy of facts. Not only is the description of every fact dependent on some theory, but there are also exist facts that cannot be unearthed except with the help of alternatives to the theory to be tested, and that become unavailable as soon as such alternatives are excluded. So it's not a matter of theories against facts, it's a matter of theories against other theories. So we need a pluralist framework. This suggests that theoretical pluralism as the basis of every test procedure. So that's the idea of theoretical pluralism. It's not only facts that are stable and that are the benchmark of any scientific theory, but you have this more sophisticated interaction between different theories that unearth empirical facts that are not available without the use of alternatives. I won't go into the details here of the technicalities and also some of the difficulties of this point of view. I just want to emphasize that there's this political background. First of all, what Feyerabend emphasizes is that theoretical pluralism is assumed just for this reason, that facts are not autonomous or not completely autonomous. Theoretical pluralism is an essential feature of all knowledge that claims to be objective, but this has also implications as far as the way the progress of knowledge or the growth of knowledge is understood. Concrete alternatives provide means of criticizing the accepted theory in a manner that goes beyond the criticism provided by a comparison of the theory with the facts. So the methodological justification of a plurality of theories lies in the fact that such a plurality allows for a much sharper criticism of accepted ideas than does the comparison with the domain of facts that is supposed to be given independently of theoretical considerations. Knowledge so conceived is not a process that converges towards an ideal view. It is an ever-increasing ocean of alternatives, so no final truth, basically, but an ever-increasing ocean of alternatives, each of them forcing the others into greater articulation, all of them contributing via this process of competition to the development of our mental faculties. So the final aim is not getting to the truth, but developing our mental faculties. And here again, we find political comparisons. Unanimity of opinion may be fitting for a church, for the frightened or dazzled victims of some ancient or modern myth, or for the weak and willing followers of some tyrant. Variety of opinion is a feature necessary for objective knowledge, and a method that encourages variety is also the only method that is compatible with the humanistic outlook. So we find again this idea of the humanistic outlook that, as we will see, goes throughout Feyerabend's philosophical output. And then, or we find also these passages, this passage in which the political aspect is also emphasized, is not tyranny the natural correlate of the idea of absolute knowledge? And is not indoctrination the method of teaching most appropriate to it? As we shall see, education is another issue that is dear to Feyerabend. Conversely, is not the idea of fallibility and the correlated demand for a multiplicity of ideas and the hope that truth will arise from the civilized clash of such ideas the essence of all democracy? So it's not just a matter of theoretical monism or pluralism, it's a matter of tyranny and democracy, indoctrination and self-development. What's the final and most important argument against the traditional theories of knowledge, according to Feyerabend? Such theories are not only ill-conceived and ill-fitted to the task of conquering nature, but their defense is also incompatible with a humanitarian outlook. So this is the big issue for Feyerabend. Not just epistemology, but the ethical and political implications of an epistemological point of view. So I would like to, this is the end basically of Feyerabend's theoretical pluralism, but we've seen as these ideas develop throughout Feyerabend, this stage of Feyerabend's thought. And I think one of the most telling points, passages that we can find in this period is from a letter from 1961 to Thomas Kuhn, in which Feyerabend makes this point very clearly. I judge the importance of a topic from the influence a specific solution of it may have upon the well-being of mankind. And by well-being of mankind, I do not mean physical well-being, but the well-being of which derives, among other things, from the exercise of one's imagination, from the full development of human faculties, and from spiritual happiness. So we see here, this is the point that Feyerabend, that underlies all of Feyerabend theoretical theorizing, I would say, if I may. So this is for theoretical pluralism. What about the skeptical phase? Now, this is interesting. The skeptical phase was a stage in Feyerabend's theorizing or intellectual development in which he started questioning, or very deeply, the outlook that, or the framework, the philosophical framework of normative epistemology that was crucial for his previous theoretical pluralism. And what's interesting we can find in this letter of December 67, at the lowest peak on this crisis, in which Feyerabend writes to Watkins that is now at a complete loss. Why is it a complete loss? Because of his Popperian faith that he had before has been put into question by some experiences that he had. I've been teaching Popperianism for now about 8 years, over 10 years when I include my time in Bristol. I gradually changed as I went on, and now I had for some reason I had a curious feeling of utter unreality. Not a single thing was correct. And why was it not correct? So let me make this point. It's interesting here to see that a philosophical position, theoretical pluralism, when it gets to a time of crisis, let crop up what's Feyerabend more basic and underlying philosophical stance. So it's interesting to look at this skeptical phase also for this reason, from methodologically speaking, because when one's position crumbles, there are some other values that support the moving on or the moving forward toward a new position. What's the point? So what's the difficulty with the Popperian framework? In addition to being unrealistic, the Popperian philosophy of science is also anti-humanitarian. It stops midway between human interest and professional interest, because the interest in truth for Feyerabend is a purely professional interest. So it lacks that humanitarian aspect that he considered to be crucial for any philosophical position. So we see here that also in this skeptical phase, the problem of the humanitarian outlook or the anti-humanitarian outlook is crucial for Feyerabend's development. So what it writes during this stage, in this paper, Science, Freedom, and the Good Life, we have a nice passage where Feyerabend highlights what one should do under the present circumstances, which might refer to the crisis of his own position. And so he says one has to look for a different ideal. And so it makes explicit what his ideal is. This new ideal should be simply to make people more pleasant and more interesting, to make life happier, to make the world better, to make the beer better, and so on. Now, one may think that this is not serious, but Feyerabend is making the point that this is exactly what it means. These are all reasonable. Moreover, I'm not being facetious when I mention things like beer, for I think it important to cut down to size those who say we must concern ourselves with nothing less than the search for truth. So if beer is good, is more important to Feyerabend than the search for truth. For what truth is, nobody really knows. Such an ideal, therefore, does not give us the direction we need. So, in this phase, in this stage in which his theoretical position or the previous theoretical position crumbles, this political stance and ethical and political stance comes to the fore. And we see it also in one of the papers that was published during this time, Consolations for the Specialist, where for the first time this radical change in his own understanding of philosophy is made explicit, and in the index we see that it's no longer a plea for tolerance in matters epistemological. It's now a plea for hedonism. Good beer. Now, where does this lead to? Of course, to against method and the epistemological anarchism of the 70s and the 80s. Now, here the political aspect is not so hard to find out, especially as against method, one of the milestones perhaps of 20th century philosophy of science, was not published in an academic by an academic publishing house, but the New Left books was cataloged, first catalog 1970-71, includes against method. Among these titles, well, this is also New Left books is not it's not Springer or Kluwer, right? It's a politically oriented, left-leaning publishing house that was born out of the New Left Review. And its symbol is also the Tetlin Tower, the symbol of the Third International. But let's look at the other titles in the catalog. So we have Lenin by Georg Lukács. We have Althusser, Reading Capital, Marxism and Philosophy. And the future titles include Between British Socialism and the British State and the Cuban Revolution, Against Method. So as we see, it's part of a project that is not exactly epistemological in the first place. It's not academic philosophy of science in the first place. But this is also clear in the title of Science in a Free Society. The idea of a free society is crucial for Feyerabend and science. The role of science in a free society is what is targeting or is the object of his reflection. All these three books and his later collection of essays, very well to reason, were published by this left-leaning publishing house, and in the meantime changed its name to Verso, referring to the left, to the page that is on the left-hand side when you when you go through a book. This is also, it's even more clear, I would say, in the title of the German version of his Against Method, which is Wider den Methodenzwang, which means against the coercion of method. Not only against method, but against method as a coercive practice. And also in his first collection of philosophical papers, it's also again explicit in the title. It's the epistemological realism and the authority of the sciences. So the theme of the authority of science is again central in Feyerabend's thought. Now, it's interesting again to look at Feyerabend's correspondence with John Watkins when he traces the origins of his change from the Popperian stance of his theoretical pluralism to epistemological anarchism. And I think I found this passage particularly revealing. Now, he's talking about the reception of Against Method, which was considered for some provocative and little more than provocative. And he's referring to the author of Against Method and saying that he's not just joking, and the crucial problem that Against Method is addressing is the problem of education. That is for him the foremost problem there is. And then he goes on in a following letter only a few weeks later, outlining the reasons for this transition from his Popperian to the anarchistic period. And what he writes is particularly interesting to me. In particular, he makes reference to the influence that futurist and Dadaist had on him. There was also my fascination with Marinetti and the Dadaists, especially the latter. Remember, the Dadaists started around the First World War, when all civilized nations and all civilized people in all civilized nations used their civilized ways of speaking and their civilized concepts such as truth, honor, duty for slaughtering each other. The Dadaists started from that fact and mocked culture, all of it. So what's the problem? That truth, the idea that you have truth in your pocket or in your hand allows you to go all the way through up to killing people, basically. But the Dadaists make fun of this self-righteousness, this feeling that all our deepest values are just embroideries to let us get away with murder, including the murder of the minds of the young. So here again, the problem of education is very strong with me, especially, and now this is also particularly interesting from a biographical point of view, especially as I have experienced in my own mind how easily one can fall for all these sham realities. Now, one may think he's referring here to his Popperian past, maybe, but he may also be referring to something deeper, given the reference to the war and well, in the case of the Dadaists, was the First World War. But as some of you may already know, and as I will emphasize later, in his case, it was the Second World War. I know how one first starts just playing the game, then comes conviction, then comes profound conviction, and suddenly one is committed when all that has happened was appeals of self-indoctrination. All this led me to my anarchist phase, and of course, I strike out against the value merchants, the truth salesmen, the singers of the duty areas, against all these fakes and vile seducers, because I'm sorry to say, I often really hate them with all their fake tolerance, with just hides their greed for recognition and for power. So again, here we have a reading of this Against Method that is not simply the academic gesture, the thought-provoking Salvador Dali of academic philosophy, but something that has a deeper drive that goes down to a certain understanding of human beings and their relations. So I could go, what's the problem with the anarchistic phase? Now, the authority now for Feyerabend is no longer the authority of facts, but it's the authority of science, the role of science in the in society, and how this is justified. So the autonomy and authority of science is justified on the basis of the success of science, and the success of science is considered to be the outcome of the scientific method to truth, and is attacking both these way of arguing for autonomy and authority of science. So on the one hand, Feyerabend says the comparative excellence of science has been anything but established. So what's this success of science? Science does not excel because of its method, for there is no method. This is his famous anti-methodological position. It does not excel because of its results. We know what science does. We have not the faintest idea whether other traditions could not do much better. So this pluralistic element and tolerant element is still present, now with a different thrust. So there's no scientific method, and the success of science is questionable. The problem is that if we keep science autonomous and we acknowledge its authority as based on these two foundations, maybe, well, we end up with the tyranny of science. On the other hand, what he's trying to outline, his idea of a free society, it's based on the democratic control of science. So the separation of state and science on the model of the separations between science and state and religion. The idea of educating mature citizens, which is again crucial, the idea of education. How do you educate not slaves of tomorrow, but independent thinkers that can evaluate and can participate in the decisions that are relevant to their own lives, and therefore also can evaluate expert opinion and supervise science. So this is his ideal. For some, this idea is rather naive or naively developed, but of course, well, and one may agree with that. But still, if one looks at it from the point of view of this political background and then the problem is trying to address, then maybe one can have a less radical and a less strict appreciation of Feyerabend's naive political philosophy. Now, I would like to emphasize a further point in this connection. That Feyerabend is attacking science in the 70s and throughout the 70s, I would say, for the role that science was playing at the time. Big science, big pharma, for example, or the problem with the atomic bomb, atomic power, and the risk of the destruction of the world, right? And the human species. But things started to change throughout the 70s and early 80s and 80s for Feyerabend. And this change can be seen if one looks at the different editions of Against Method. We have at least 5 of them, because we have 3 English editions, and then we have 2 German editions. And in addition to them, we also have the essay Against Method that was published in the 70s. But if one looks first at this 2 edition of Against Method, we see immediately that something has happened between 76 and 83, namely the anarchistic aspect, what was considered to be the more political and problematic aspect of Against Method, his apparent support of anarchism, is dropped. So in the second edition, in the second German edition of Against Method, the subtitle outline of an anarchistic theory of knowledge is no longer there. And this is also the case with the second edition, the second English edition. If we compare the title pages of these two works, on the left-hand side we have the 75 edition, and on the right-hand side the 88 edition, we see that outline of an anarchistic theory of knowledge, this famous subtitle with a note, with a footnote, is no longer present in the second edition. This is rather superficial, perhaps not, because he was attacked heavily for his apparent countenancing of violence that is associated with anarchism. Maybe he should have chosen Dadaism, Dadaist theory of knowledge, as he also was emphasizing in some footnotes of his first edition of Against Method. But what's more interesting is a change that intervened in the last edition of Against Method, in the introduction of the work. If we see the first two editions, in the introduction, Feyerabend wrote at the end of the introduction, commenting on the outlook that he was, or the perspective that he was advancing. There is no need to fear that the diminished concern for law and order in science and society that characterizes an anarchism of this kind will lead to chaos. The anarchism of this kind is the anarchism is advancing. There may, of course, come a time when it will be necessary to give reason a temporary advantage, and then when it will be wise to defend its rules to the exclusion of everything else. I do not think that we are living in such a time today. But when was today? 1975, when the book was published, 1988, when the book was revised, but in the third edition, 1993, Feyerabend adds a footnote to this passage and writes, "This was my opinion in 1970 when I wrote the first version of this essay. These times have changed, and considering some tendencies, for example, in US education, again, politically correct academic menus, in philosophy, and in the world at large, I think that reason should now be given greater weight. Not because it is and always was fundamental, but because it seems to be needed in circumstances that occur rather frequently today, but may disappear tomorrow, to create a more humane approach." So again, his playing the enemy of science was instrumental to balancing the powers at play at a certain time in his life, and with the aim of promoting a humane approach in human relationships. So we see this what I tried to show, let me check the time. Yes, I'm almost done. What I tried to show is that throughout Feyerabend's intellectual development, we have this anti-authoritarian theme that is leading and driving the development of his thought. What I now would try to emphasize is some possible origins of this stance that Feyerabend took. Now, one of them is more intellectual, and the other one is more biographical. So let's get to the intellectual one, humanism, Feyerabend's humanism. I think that there are, and in particular his hedonism, right? The importance of good beer. Cutting down to size values to what can be evaluated by any human beings, and not putting big words and as our values that are ambiguous and even perhaps dangerous. So what can be said about this? Well, for some this is naive, But you can find a very similar position in Neurath, idea of felicitology. In this case, Neurath doesn't speak about hedonism, but he used this expression, social Epicureanism. Now, if we look at the Neurath of the 40s, we find passages that are strikingly similar to what Feyerabend was saying. For example, in this paper, International Planning for Freedom, what Neurath says about the role of science is particularly interesting. Assume that scientists tell the English people that their fireplaces waste calories. Of course, they do so enormously, but this is not beer, then it's fireplaces. But the fireplaces as an element of our environment are not happiness neutral, as it were. The fireplaces are related to homely comfort and to many customs of our private life. How to compute these and other items of happiness condition would be the subject of discussion and finally of decisions based on common sense and influenced by the scientist's information. But the final decision, so scientist's information can only play a part in this, in the way in which scientific results are implemented in everyday life. One should also take into account other elements that are cut down to size of the men on the streets or everyday people. People of the totalitarian kind may try to make scientists the leaders of a new society, like the magicians, nobles, or churchmen of former societies. The encyclopedism of logical empiricism does not see why scientists train to discover as many alternatives as possible. Again, the pluralistic aspect that Feyerabend was emphasizing during his theoretical pluralism phase should be particularly able to select one alternative only, one that never can be based on calculation by making a decision or performing an action for other people with different desires and attitudes. So we can see here that this apparently naive position of Feyerabend, well, at least has some distinguished predecessor. But there's also another point of Feyerabend, anti-authoritarianism, of course, and this has to do with his own experience of an authoritarian regime. And this is particularly interesting because Feyerabend grew up and was educated in Austria right at the time when Austria was becoming a rump of the Nazi Germany, right? And he was drafted into the army as soon as he graduated from high school. So, and what happened to him was that he was sent to war, served in the army, served in the Wehrmacht, and ended up with 3 bullets in his spine that left him impotent, limp, and with chronic pains throughout his life. So we can see, for example, here a young Feyerabend with a crutch right after the war. And this was something that he had to live throughout his life, not being able to move. He was a war veteran, basically, with serious wounds. Not to tell about the impotence and about the nightmares of which he tells us about in his autobiography. So, and the chronic pain that reminded him on a daily basis what it meant to be grown up and educated into a regime in which one single model was considered to be the only possible model, and which could bring you to make actions that would be regret in the future. And this condition, I think, is quite unique and should be kept in mind if we think of the reasons why Feyerabend's anti-authoritarianism is such a deep and continuous influence in his own theoretical production. Thank you. I'm done. I hope you appreciated and you enjoyed the presentation.
We certainly did. Thank you very much, Matteo. Thank you very much for the talk, which creates a lot of interesting resonances with previous talks, and in particular with Silke Kolber's, especially for the closing on Neurath. Silke had shown us how Neurath can be read as part of this larger, perhaps, movement of scientific humanism, and perhaps Feyerabend's humanism is of a different sort, maybe. But we leave this and many more points open to discussion. I see Silke as, since she has just been mentioned, she has just raised her hands, and I have also another person on my list. So keep just right up your hand.
Okay, so I have to apologize because I'm sitting at a cafe, and I hope you can hear me. But yeah, I was